About one more minute. All right, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to session 6 of Fitzgerald Summer School. I am Kirk Kernut, and I have just a couple announcements, and then I'm going to turn it over to our host for the hour. Please remember that we do have a lot more webinars coming up, a lot more sessions of summer school on Friday, July 2nd at 9 a.m. Eastern time. That's 8 a.m. for me, so I will have a paper bag over my head. But that'll be, I believe, 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock European time. We will be highlighting the work of our Kiel Donaldson graduate students who have won our travel stipend to come to you all the way through Zoom. And we're going to we have 9 students, 3 of whom are doing a group project, and they are all going to get about 10 minutes each. So we're excited for that. And then next week, I want to emphasize that next Wednesday, July 7th, we have 3 certified rock stars of Fitzgerald Studies, Sarah Churchwell, James L.W. West III, and David Brown. We're going to get together for a fun session called F. Scott Fitzgerald in His Time, in which they are going to delve into some of the forgotten history that we should remember of the 1920s and 1930s. Then on July 12th, you're going to want to tune in for the Where in the World is Scott and Zelda, because not only are we going to take you around the world and violate the trademark of Carmen Sandiego as much as we can, but we are going to announce where the 2023 Fitzgerald Society conference is going to be. So I know you're going to want to be there for that. And then finally, and I would ask folks who are working with grad students to be thinking about this as well. 2 weeks from today, on July 14th, we will wrap up with a writing and publishing webinar co-hosted by the Fitzgerald Review, the Hemingway Review. We're going to have Lee Zimmerman from the 20th Century Literature. We're going to have a couple acquisition editors, and folks from the Arizona Quarterly are going to join us as well to talk about what to do to be able to get published painlessly and to really prepare your work for market. So that'll be a fun and hopefully educational session. So on that note, all this information is available on our website, www.fscottfitzgeraldsociety.org. You can sign up for all of these. We have all of the announcements and everything over on our Facebook page as well. And with that announcement, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Helen Turner, who has put this wonderful session together. I should mention that part of the reason we wanted to do a session on teaching Fitzgerald globally is we had a great session on Sunday, a very dynamic session with North American high school teachers. As we were putting these sessions together, it became very clear that we should also talk about internationalism. And I think for those of us who teach Fitzgerald in the United States, we tend to be a little nationalistic about the themes like the American dream and the settings. So we wanted to look at how Fitzgerald is taught abroad and why he's taught abroad. So Dr. Helen Turner graciously agreed to put this panel together, and she's got some excellent folks on here that she will introduce. Helen was awarded her PhD at the University of Essex in 2015. She's affiliated, an affiliated lecturer both at Linnaeus University in Sweden, as well as an English teacher at St. Thomas More High School in the UK. She's published work on Fitzgerald, Richard Yates, Archibald MacLeish, and Tom Wolfe. And most importantly, her guide for high school teachers and university teachers on how to teach Fitzgerald called Breaking Down Fitzgerald, will be published by Josie Bass in early 2022. I should say it was supposed to be published in the fall of 2021, but a couple author societies did not get their manuscripts done as quickly as Helen did. So she has been put in a bit of limbo. But on that note, Helen, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to mute my microphone and remove this big pimple on my nose from the screen so I'm not distracting folks.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm going to just spend the first couple of minutes introducing this wonderful panel that we've got here. We're one member down, unfortunately. Jonathan, our South African teacher, is on a school trip in Swaziland, and internet connection is not what it should be or could be. So he's sent through some stuff that I'll be sharing with you as we go along. But for those people that are here, we have Elisabeth Bouzonviller, who is a professor of American literature at Jean Monnet University in Saint-Étienne in France. She wrote a PhD dissertation on Fitzgerald's novels, Francis Scott Fitzgerald, ou la plénitude de silence, which was in 2000. She also published Francis Scott Fitzgerald, Écrivain de déséquilibre in 2000. She contributed to A Distant Drummer, Foreign Perspectives on F. Scott Fitzgerald in 2007, and Fitzgerald in Context in 2013. She also works on Native American literature and has published the only French critical analysis of Louise Erddich's work, Louise Erdich, Métissage et Écriture, Histoire d'Amérique. She has been a member of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Society since 1999, and she is a member of the editorial board of its review. She co-organised the Lyon conference in 2011, which was my first conference, and it was a great one. 10 years ago, can you believe, next month? With her friends and colleagues, Marie-Agnes Gay and Catherine Delasalle Nancy. She was also in charge with Marie-Agnes of the academic programme for the Toulouse conference in 2019. Then we have Dan Jenkins, who is a secondary school teacher of some 30 years. The first text he ever taught was Gatsby, and he's taught it innumerable times since then to mixed classes at A-level. We teach in predominantly a boys' school, but our sixth form is girls and boys. So this is a text that is taught to a mixed group. After spending 12 years as head of English, he is now teaching and learning leader at the school with a particular interest in principles of instruction and closing the vocabulary gap. He also told me that he first read this book on the back of a coach on a ride back from Bristol in the west of England to his home. There's an ex-girlfriend involved somewhere. She's not on the scene anymore, but the book has stayed a constant in his life. So he's a voracious reader, and I can testify to that. And after all these years, he's still a huge Fitzgerald fan. We've got Niklas Salmose, who is an associate professor of literatures in English and vice chair of the Department of Languages at Linnaeus University in Sweden. He's a member of the Linnaeus University Centre of Intermedial and Multimodal Studies and has done work on intermediality, and more recently, the intersection between intermediality and eco-media. He's published articles on Fitzgerald, nostalgia and translation for the F. Scott Fitzgerald Review. He's translated All the Sad Young Men into Swedish, and I have a copy. I haven't been able to read it. My Swedish isn't what it could be. And is currently working on a Swedish version of the Tarleton trilogy. He's the founder and teacher of the master's course F. Scott Fitzgerald and the Jazz Age, and is currently co-editing Fitzgerald, a composite biography with David Rennie, which is bound for the University of Minnesota Press. In November 2018, he was the third annual McDermott Lecturer at the University Faculty Club in St. Paul for the Fitzgerald in St. Paul Society, and he's going to be editing The Last Tycoon for the Centennial Oxford Classics reissue of Fitzgerald's major works. And finally, we have Natsuo Chiyoda, who is Associate Professor of American Literature at Kagoshima University. His main focus of study is Fitzgerald, and he presented a paper at the 2019 conference in Toulouse, Fitzgerald and the Gothic. We were actually on the same panel for that one. He's also coordinated a symposium on Edith Wharton at the annual meeting of the Kyosho American Literature Society this spring. So there's our panelists. Let's get started then. What I wanted us to start with, actually, before we even think about the teaching of the novel, is what the expectations students have for this novel when they first approach it. And I think we also have to think about at what point in their academic careers they are perhaps approaching this for the first time. So if we're thinking about at high school level, I asked Jonathan this. He teaches obviously in South Africa, and this novel is taught in South Africa to grade 10 students. So they are 15 and 16. He's also at an all-boys school. And so he said to me when I asked him what their expectations were, he said that they were primarily actually quite negative, basically because of the year that the novel was published. And so they find that kind of going back even 100 times kind of problematic for them. What he also said, though, was actually some exposure to the Lerman film, although some of us and many of us have some problems and concerns with the film, does actually improve their expectations. So I thought I'll ask Dan first, because he's teaching students that are a little bit older than 15 or 16. They're 17 or 18, so quite a big, I think, development goes on in those couple of years. What is the expectations you find in your classrooms when you first approach teaching this novel?
Yeah, so we teach sort of like 16 to 19-year-olds, A-level students. So they've done their sort of basic GCSE, their secondary education, and they've chosen literature as a subject. So I think what I tend to find is obviously the Lerman, you can't get away from the contemporary Lerman film. You can't get away from the fact that a lot of their first impressions are very sort of much based around the sort of flapper idea, or, you know, with Leonardo DiCaprio sort of proffering us a glass of fizz or whatever in his tuxedo. And so there is that kind of, and also in the kind of common culture, the idea of Gatsby parties or Gatsby themed parties without them really knowing what Gatsby is. So they have that kind of idea of the, if you like, of the costumes of Fitzgerald. But I think the thing that I find most interesting is often the very first text they're doing as an A-level text, and that means it's the first kind of exposure they've got to, if you like, adult literature, as opposed to the kind of set texts that they've had for their GCSEs. Those kind of texts, to be honest, what they're mainly doing with those texts is understanding plot, understanding character, a little bit about theme, an awful lot of spoon feeding going on, I think, and, you know, them learning key quotes and that kind of thing in a kind of regurgitative kind of approach. Whereas obviously when you come to doing it at this level, you're spending 6, 8, 9 weeks on a text, and you're kind of living with that text for a long time. And so I think that what I feel is that they're actually quite wrong-footed at the start, because they're suddenly being introduced to something that is much more complicated than they used to, and something that they've got to work a bit harder at to get to the good stuff in it. But generally, I find that they're quite excited about doing something that is a bit more, well, I mean, I suppose you could argue it's not hugely modern from their perspective, but it's much more modern than, for example, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or Christmas Carol. At least the one thing about Fitzgerald is you can follow it, you know, in a way that maybe you find a Christmas Carol and things like that a bit harder. So I tend to find it's quite positive, because they're coming straight into the subject and they're quite excited about doing something new and different. And that's when you've got to kind of harness the enthusiasm and sort of go with it, I think.
Great, thanks, Dan. I'm interested as well now then, if we think about from the perspectives that Niklas and Elisabeth and Natsuo is coming from, where not only are we kind of moving further along the academic process, we're now at undergraduate level, or certainly in Niklas's case, and I think in Elisabeth's, some postgraduate work going on as well. But we're also now looking at a novel that is written in the students, predominantly their second, I would imagine, for some, possibly even their third language. How does that then impact what their expectations are? Do they come to the novel already knowing all about it? Is it something kind of strange and new, or is it already very, very familiar to them because of the overarching influence of American culture globally? I don't know who wants to start with that one. Elisabeth, do you want to start us off with that?
Okay. I teach Gatsby to second-year undergraduate students in France. And I think at the beginning, they're a bit worried about reading a whole novel in English and a poetic novel, let's say. But very often on our first class, I mention the movies, the various ones. And most of the time, if I mention DiCaprio, they realize that they know something about the book. So it's a good start, although I always tell them that they may watch the movie for the atmosphere, but they must read the book. I'm not sure they all do it, but they are supposed to do it. And very often the idea of mentioning the movies is good to make them realize what we are going to focus upon. That it's a good start when they are worried about reading in a second language. Mm-hmm. That's the beginning of things. Mm-hmm. So maybe as a start, I can say that, and Niklas will go on. Yeah. I'm sure Scandinavian students are much more comfortable with their second language than French students, unfortunately for us.
Niklas?
Well, thank you, Elisabeth. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's been taught both in English departments, but also in comparative literature departments, if you think about university studies. So it's actually used both in original, but also in translations. So, but I'm mostly familiar with using it, of course, in its original. Yeah, well, the post Baz Luhrmann thing has offered us a way to introduce this novel that I think creates a certain kind of vibe towards it that has been, at least to me, quite useful. Whether they've seen it or not, I usually play a small sequence of the film, and then we read that sequence in the book and compare, and then we say that you're gonna read the whole novel now, and we're going to talk about it more extensively later. But so it's created a retro vibe about the Jazz Age and architecture, music, clothing, fashion, that makes students quite engaged and interested in this particular time frame that the Gatsby operates within. But I would like to sort of reiterate perhaps back to some more general Swedish-American relations, because I think they play in. Because Sweden has a very special relationship to the U.S. Due to the enormous migration that occurred between 1880 and 1920. That was like 1 million of the Swedes basically went to the U.S. and that created an intimate connection to the U.S. that has lasted ever since, I think, and especially after the advent of television, a lot of the media obviously has come from the U.S. So we've been influenced by American conceptualizations of themselves and adore the culture and the progress that the American cultural society has been doing ever since the 60s and onwards. And although we might have a slightly ambivalent relationship to the U.S. considering the last decades of politics, perhaps, but there's still a basic positive attitude in Swedish context towards American things. And I think that for a lot of people, The Great Gatsby or Fitzgerald, which is very known as a popular phenomena in Sweden through newspapers and television and so on, is somehow the quintessential American novel also for Swedes. So I think for various reasons, students going in, reading this novel, they are mostly positively attuned, although they are always negatively attuned that they have to be reading a novel. But this novel seems to be one of the least horrible ones that exists there. So it's short, yeah, and they know the narrative. But so on a very general note, I think it's there for that reason. But then there are connections between Sweden and The Great Gatsby that go perhaps beyond that. And I'm thinking that for Scandinavians, the summers are very special. You freeze to death for about 8 months and it's all dark, and suddenly you have that opportunity to live out the perfect summer. And The Great Gatsby is a story about the idea of the perfect summer, right? So it speaks to a very specific Swedish or Scandinavian, I would say, sentiment that I think also opens up for identifications, not only with characters or themes in general, but the atmosphere of that particular summer novel.
And that's interesting, actually, just thinking more generally. Often you think actually of those English novels of that period as well, this kind of idea of this summer that usually underneath it there's something awful and sinister going on, but it has this feeling of kind of this perfect period of time before tragedy or disaster or realization kind of descends. That's your
maybe to answer what Niklas has just said about the relationship between Sweden and the United States. One interesting aspect of The Great Gatsby that I can rely on to present the book to the students is the fact that it was written mainly written while the Fitzgeralds were in France on the French Riviera. So this is a good point for me when I must introduce the book, and I can mention the fact that all those expatriate writers and artists came to France and enjoyed the place, and The Great Gatsby was written mainly on the French Riviera. So this is a good tool and a way of getting some response from the students.
Absolutely, yes. So in Japan, how is it received? I mean, how familiar are students when they first come to this book?
Unfortunately, we don't have any such geographical connection between Gatsby and Japan, but well, at least university students are very familiar with American literature, but unfortunately not with American literature or literature itself. So I don't think most of them are familiar with The Great Gatsby. I mean, the title or the Fitzgerald. But, well, so it's kind of hard for me what expectations they have, but because I just introduced Gatsby as a reading assignment. So it's kind of, they have no choice, they have to read anyway. But the response is quite good because it's so, I mean, visually beautiful. And I don't think there is any conspicuous common points between Japanese culture and what's depicted in that novel, but still, yeah, they enjoyed that novel. Yeah, some of them might have watched the movie. I mean, the latest movie by Baz Luhrmann, but Baz Luhrmann's film has it's almost like 9 or 10 years since it was released. So it's not contemporary.
Yeah, I suppose, and for young students, 10 years ago is half their lifetime ago. So it's contemporary for us. But for anybody, you know, if you're 20, it was like, well, it was half my lifetime ago. So, you know, I suppose we have to start thinking along those lines too. In terms then of actually teaching this novel, again, we've got, you know, people working at different, you know, academic stages. But is your focus the content and the themes? I was speaking to Niklas a couple of weeks back, this idea that although we often speak about how beautiful his language is and how what a stylist he is, often the book is still approached in terms of its themes, its contents, rather than actually its how it's being put together. So Dan, what's your focus, or do you start with content and theme and then move on, or how do you approach that issue of what to focus on?
I think obviously I'm quite lucky because you know, I get to spend a long time with this text, to be honest. You know, it's one of their core texts. They probably study 6 to 8 texts over 2 years. So I get living room with this text, so it's quite useful. And basically, yeah, context at some stage, but I'm really just very interested in reading. Absolutely fundamentally interested in reading. So we will read every single word in class. Well, we will read every single word in class. I will read every single word in class, probably, because yeah. And so, but that might sound, you know, sort of incredible. But what that does is it allows me to really concentrate on the style. It allows me to do the job that I think that's really important for any educator, which is to be the enthusiast, and to really do that thing. And I was talking, fortunately, I work with a colleague who I did teach many years ago. And I said to him, I taught you Gatsby, didn't I? And he said, yeah, I still remember. I still remember you teaching me Gatsby. And I said, did I do that thing where I just sort of stopped occasionally and said, let's reread this again. Let's hear this bit again. Let's hear this bit again. Let's just appreciate how lovely that sentence is, you know. So I spend a lot of time on just sort of really, and I suppose what I'm trying to do is that we've got children from quite a range of backgrounds who may not possess huge chunks of cultural capital, and I think it's an important job. A part of what I'm trying to do is to generate that cultural capital and to get them to appreciate, you know, works of art and works of beauty, and then at times we start then we can pause and stop and so say, right, okay, contextually, what do we need to know? What's missing? And then that's quite important, again, cultural capital wise, you know, for them to understand, okay, the world was a different place. Things were different then. Things happened in a different way. So I'm really, you know, and I think the other thing is I want to read the whole thing so that they've got some understanding of the, if you like, the architecture of it all, before we start sort of going for, you know, symbolism or themes, or which are all really important and all beautiful and fantastic. I'm not denigrating any of them, but I think sometimes the students can feel like there's a kind of tick list. Oh, look, there's another example of eyes. There's another example of the moon. Oh, look, there's another moon, you know. And in a way, they you want them to feel it in the round and to feel it in the whole first. And then obviously come back in and think about, you know, the Valley of the Ashes. Why is that important? What does that maybe say about 1920s and capitalism, or whatever it might well be? But I want them to enjoy the work of art in some way as much as anything. I know that sounds rather idealistic, and we're in a Fitzgerald thing, we're allowed to be idealistic. But you know, that sort of sense that, you know, I'm kind of trying to teach them how to read a book almost in some ways. Does that make sense?
I think it is about that appreciation rather than just, like you say, that kind of, you know, at GCSE, it's kind of demonstrating the ability to identify certain features or characteristics or motifs or whatever. But you want them to become sophisticated, active readers, you know, reading as an active, something that you
and you don't want them to be
do.
jaded and cynical either. You want them to, you know, love it. You want them to love literature. That's what you're here for, you know, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And so if we move on then to when we were, say, at undergraduate level, Elisabeth, you were saying that for your undergraduates, it might be one of the first texts that they're reading kind of completely in English, for example. What is your focus then? I mean, and the other thing I'm interested in knowing, and I'm interested to know how it differs in different parts of the world, is how much use do you make of translation? You know, do you, when they're reading it in English, do they have a copy of it in French? Do you ask them to translate parts of it, or is it simply you work with the text in English and you don't kind of allow that kind of, right, well, let's see how we could translate this into French, or let's see how this translation has been done? What's your approach there?
With the second year students, those undergraduates, they're supposed to read in English. And if they want to read a translation, they can on the side, but they're not supposed to, because the goal of that course, based on the Great Gatsby, is to help them develop literary criticism, the ability to write essays about literature in general. And we use the Great Gatsby, well, actually, I have chosen the Great Gatsby as a kind of example, a tool to improve their critical approach to literature. So they've got to read the text in English, and they've got to work on the text in English. We work on the idea of the narrator, symbolism, rhetoric, poetry, and all those elements. And the idea is that they rely on the Great Gatsby to do that. They should be then able to write critical essays on the text. And it's not a course this one is not a course related to translation.
Right.
Probably they read translations to help them, but they don't tell me.
I remember doing that in my French A-level when we were doing Francois Mauriac. I had my English translation to my side when I was working on it. In Sweden, Niklas, what's your approach there? I mean, I would imagine it varies at what stage you're teaching it. I mean, I was lucky enough to come over to Sweden with your MA module and teach on that. And obviously, everything was in English. There was no reference to translations or Swedish versions. And it was quite clear that it wasn't just because I was in the room. The whole course was completed in English. I mean, I think as well, like Elisabeth was saying, I think probably what's kind of interesting about Sweden in particular, though, is that the fluency level is, I mean, it's mastery. I mean, I don't know at what stage, but certainly all the Swedish students that I work with, they speak like native speakers. They have that level of mastery. So I suppose translations for you is just more something that might pose some interest, or it's not a teaching aid per se.
Well, sorry. Well, yeah, they're very proficient in speaking, but they're not that proficient in writing, unfortunately, which makes it a bit of a challenge when you come to essay writing. But yeah, I've been teaching, Fitzgerald at both undergrad and graduate, and I was very curious about how the Great Gatsby is being used in Swedish higher education. So we are currently working on a volume called Fitzgerald in a Swedish Context, and one chapter is devoted to how the Great Gatsby is used in undergraduate education in Sweden. So my colleague Carolina Eugenes, who's been also a part of Fitzgerald conferences previously, has actually done some research. So she's been looking through all the higher education syllabi to see where the Great Gatsby is actually being taught. And it turns out that at almost every university in Sweden, it's on the syllabus for the first or second term studies. So it's a very, very common book to use. And so she continued by asking questions to teachers to see in what capacity they're actually teaching this book, if it's very diverse or if they have a very, very similar approach. And it appears to be, fairly diverse. So there are those kind of classical things that you talk about it as a tragedy. You think about the American dream, materialism, social stratification, but also perhaps less typical perspectives like intertextuality, narrative technique, characterization. And I think these latter ones seem to suggest that there is, I think, a larger focus on the stylistic perspective on the Great Gatsby than perhaps in the US, UK context, where studies are perhaps predominantly focusing on context and themes and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it is, for example, in my own course, the Great Gatsby is used as an introduction to narratology. So the book is not used as a thematic analysis book. It's actually a book where we deciphered the novel as in terms of structure and style, to use and become familiar with important literary terms and terminology, which means that we have a slightly different focus on this novel than as kind of a historical text, at least in the first term students. So I think, yeah, and then the other thing I would like to stress is that a lot of students in English are actually teacher trainee students, so they are going to become English teachers. So a strong focus on teaching novels in general is a literary didactic perspective. So how can these be used in upper secondary school? So then you may choose to think about themes that are predominantly used in secondary schools. So social struggle, class, perhaps even love and passion as a topic. And it's interesting to see that engagement of the Great Gatsby at the undergraduate level is starting to spill over to upper secondary school, where we see an increased use of the Great Gatsby in various degrees in part of their English education. So I think Fitzgerald and Great Gatsby is becoming more engaging at younger years in Sweden because of the work that has been done at the university level. Finally, thinking about undergrad here, I just want to echo what Dan talked about. Personally, my desire has been to allow students to meet this text on their own stance. So seeing this text and using this text as part of an aesthetic reading rather than an efferent reading. So trying to allow the students to meet their text on their own, and then we can sort of collect those kind of impressions and experiences and see what we can make of them, rather than starting at the other side where we're trying to give specific questions or themes or topics to think about while going into this book. And I found this highly rewarding, particularly with The Great Gatsby, because it seems to, its universal capacity seems to mirror a lot of different emotions among students from different ages. I mean, just like Philip wrote here in the chat that he met The Great Gatsby at an early age, and I read it in high school in the US when I was 15. And it just doesn't matter what time or what culture you belong to. There's something universal there that bounces back to you. And if you allow the text to speak that kind of language to you, I think students will be more appreciative of its aesthetic qualities.
It's interesting, actually, talking about when we first read it, like you were saying, Philip has obviously a clear memory there in Belfast. Dan reading it on the back of the bus, you know, with the story of the ex-girlfriend that maybe we'll hear about later. I remember reading it. My sister was studying at A-level. She was 5 years older than me. So I read it at 12. Of course, my reading of it at 12 was again, I mean, I think that's what's so interesting about it, is that it's deceptively simple. So I could read it at 12 and think I'd understood it, and, you know, and of course, then you come back when you're studying, you're reading it at 16 or then at university at 21, and you think, oh no, this is far more complicated than that initial reading suggested. So I think that's interesting. And it does seem to be a book that does, you read it and you have a memory of having read it. I don't know if that makes sense, but I have certain books, I have a memory, a reading memory of having read them. Other books, they don't resonate in the same way. So Natsuo, in Japan,
Yes.
what is your focus? Is it concerned primarily with looking at the style and the language? Are you more concerned with themes and the content?
First of all, I focus on theme and content, because style, maybe analyzing style or language style, is a little too hard for sophomore junior students.
Mm.
But after reading the story, I mean, well enough, we can talk about style, maybe comparing with other writers, such as Hemingway.
Mm-hmm.
So it is so conspicuous, even to Japanese students. So that's the way I treat with the style in my class.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, like you say, that kind of the difference in those two styles is going to make actually Fitzgerald's particular approach to writing, I suppose, more clearer to, as you said, you know, a sophomore whose English proficiency is going to be good, obviously, but not that kind of complete level of mastery that maybe in later years they would have. Where should we go now? I was thinking there's a couple of kind of directions I want to take this, if that's okay. I think the first thing that I think we're going to have to think a little bit about, we spoke about it quite a lot, or it came up quite a lot in the conversation about teaching it in US high schools, and obviously we've had the sessions on Fitzgerald and race. What I wanted to think a little bit about was how do you approach some of these, some of the ambivalence in the novel? I mean, we were hearing, I think it was one of the conversations on race, where somebody, I'm not sure if it was a high school teacher or a university teacher, where students were actually refusing to read this book after they come across the description of Wolfsheim and the black characters in the car. It was almost like down tools. I'm not engaging with this. I'm not reading this. How do you engage with perhaps the ambivalence that is quite clear in the novel towards race, towards gender, and how do you make it something that you encourage students to not shy away from, but confront head on? And actually, while we're thinking about that, do you have students that are resistant to these representations? I mean, if you don't mind, I'm just going to speak a little bit about what Jonathan sent me. Obviously, he's teaching, excuse me, in South Africa. Obviously, a very particular context that he is teaching that novel in. And he says that he tends to focus on the overarching concept of the possibility that America at this point in history seems to offer, irrelevant of those kind of strict racial and ethnic divisions of the time. And I think he then ties it to this idea that it's a universal idea that Fitzgerald is exploring, and he's exploring through those characters, even if he's portraying them ambivalently. So, for example, the African Americans in the car, for example, although it's quite, the way Nick speaks about them is quite negative, it does also show the possibility that has perhaps been opened up to African Americans at that point. Interestingly, he says the depiction of Wolfsheim, although stereotypical, it doesn't seem to impact his students in South Africa. They don't presumably recognise it as, perhaps that's, again, they're 15 or 16, perhaps they're not familiar with those tropes. And then he also says, the African Americans we encounter, although described in specific terms, also tend to highlight the idea of the dream. These questions of depiction are significant within a South African context, and exploring them and how the historical context informs such observations opens many avenues of discussion within a classroom setting. How do we engage with historical literature from a modern zeitgeist and divorce ourselves from a purely reactionary response? And he finds that the boys engage meaningfully with that. And he also said that it allows them to depart from the narrative and place of the novel and think about it in more kind of universal context. So Dan, how do you deal with that? Do you find that students are troubled or concerned, or are they slightly oblivious, or has that changed over your 30 years of teaching this novel?
I think this is the very first thing I was going to say. I think 30 years ago, it was, I wouldn't say it was glossed, but I think it was something that you know was not something that troubled the vast majority of the students, and obviously it was taught a very culturally diverse group of students. But I think obviously in more contemporary times, it's certainly something that, you know, it sticks out, it rubs the wrong way when you read it. And I think that one of the things that I've done more and more as I've taught it is to bring in other texts. So, for example, I'll bring in Toni Morrison, for example, and talk about Jazz, her novel, and the way in which she depicts a very different kind of, another kind of jazz age, if you like. Talk about the Harlem Renaissance. But also, I think it's also, I was talking earlier about cultural capital. One of the things to think about is, you know, there were times that were not like this. You know, and I think that's part of their education, is to understand that there were times when people had different views and had different ways of thinking about things, and certainly different ways of representing people. And while we may find it discomforting now to read some of that stuff, we have to place it back in its cultural context. I think that's quite important. But I also have to, I think, when you asked me for the description of myself, I said male, pale, and stale, and I have to understand that is my, you know, I am male, pale, and stale, and I have to understand that not everybody in my classroom is those things, and I have to be aware from it. I don't think we can shy away from it, I think, is partly what I'm saying. I think sometimes, the way, interestingly, your South African correspondent was saying about Wolfsheim, I think in some ways people are more prepared to gloss over the sort of potentially anti-Semitic depictions rather than the racist depictions. But I think one of the ways to think about Wolfsheim is that balance. I think it would be a lot worse if we didn't have Tom. I mean, that Tom as a kind of, as you know, Tom is equally, is even more reprehensible. And I think Fitzgerald allows his mask to slip there, and actually he tells us to judge Tom, doesn't he? He tells us to judge Tom, and he tells us, you know, that Tom is essentially stupid, and the whole bit about the rise of the master races and all the rest of it. And I think that's important in some ways, that, you know, that if Wolfsheim was the sole, inverted commas, villain of the piece, I think that would be a much harder thing to bear. But I think also it's just that they have to understand, you know, that you're going to read stuff that's going to have depictions in that nowadays are not particularly pleasant. If you're going to read T.S. Eliot, if you're going to read Dickens and Shylock, if you're going to read this stuff, there's going to be stuff there you can't, and you're not always just going to be able to spend life reading stuff that makes you feel good. I think so. There's a tough lesson in there somewhere, but I think the key thing is, you've got, if you're dealing with like 16 to 19-year-olds, whatever, you've got to negotiate through, and you've got to be prepared to have some difficult conversations, I think, but also at the same time, hopefully work as almost like a signpost to work your way through this issue. I think, I don't think any good's going to come from just down tools and just not engaging entirely. That's quite hard. You know, you're not going to learn something that way, I think.
And I think the other thing is, I think the other way that you can look at it is that he's writing at a moment of real change, of real flux, of real kind of changing attitudes to a lot of these subjects that, you know, prior to the First World War were kind of set in stone. The attitudes to women, towards race, towards all manner of things. And I think in some ways we can look at our moment as a similar moment, in terms of we seem to be living in a moment of a huge amount of flux and change, and changing attitudes towards all kinds of topics that I think automatically leads to kind of an ambivalence towards change. I think, you know, I think we also have to look at it as part of learning and as part of the human experience, that at times as your thought processes are being challenged, you may feel ambivalent towards some of the change that you're seeing around you. And that's part of the process. And I think perhaps that's one way that we can incorporate his ambivalence in a meaningful way. It's how we change, it's how we learn, is through that process of being challenged and then being unsure and uncertain, and perhaps reconciling ourselves to what's happening around us. That's
and the other thing is, that something that I do is, and sometimes with a bit of fun, is say, well, hang on a minute, what's a name like James Gatz anyway? Doesn't James Gatz, you know, that's potentially a Jewish name, isn't it? You know, is this a guy who who is passing as something else. And then, of course, I give them the interpretation that is Gatsby this light-skinned black character who is passing, you know, up in the north there. And just, you know, these kinds of things do sometimes help work our way through sort of, you know, ideas of representations and potential identities. But, you know, so there isn't an ideal, there isn't a solution. That's the point. That's literature. There isn't a solution. It's a case. Let's have the discussion in a mature way in which we can get something out of it, I think.
Elisabeth, Niklas, Natsuo, anything to add to that?
Yeah, yes. As for ambiguity, ambivalence itself, I'm very positive about discussing gender ambivalence, mainly Nick's possible homosexuality, because Great Gatsby is so famous as a love romance between man and woman, but the main plot of romance between Daisy and Gatsby is so vague, abstract, that even the Japanese student can feel that. And what's vividly appealing to us is, or grotesquely depicted, is something non-heterosexual, such as Nick's love toward Gatsby, or I don't know what to say. So yeah, so as for ambivalence, I'm very interested. I'm very positive about talking about gender, sexuality, ambivalence in the class.
Yeah, I do. I think it's a deeply ambivalent novel on all, you know, in all kinds of ways. It's certainly open to all kinds of readings. Time is marching on. I was hoping actually to.
Can we add something to this, or
yes, of course.
We're running out of time, Helen, here, because I just wanted to I agree with you that the flux of the 20s is very similar to the flux that we are living in. So that's why it's quite easy to sell in not only the Great Gatsby, but I think high modernist literature in general, and art and culture. There are these kind of similarities that you can make. So I just wanted to say that race is not a huge thing to talk about in literary scholarship in Sweden, unfortunately. But obviously, if a high school student has done any kind of literary analysis, it's been you know, gender or feminist or perhaps even queer. So students come in with that type of perspective, and it's unavoidable to talk about the Great Gatsby from sort of gender feminist perspectives, and it's usually taken up. But the problem, I think, is if you have 2 hours to talk about this book at the graduate level, I think it's a bit unfortunate to put the focus on either race or gender in a book like this. There are better novels to use if that's what you want to sort of unpack from literature to teach students about these kind of topics. So that's why I tend to, at undergraduate level, not to focus on these kind of things, although if it comes up, I'm happy to talk about them. But in our master class, which is a whole semester just studying Fitzgerald, basically, you have opportunity to talk about stereotyping, ethics, ethnicity, race, class, all these kind of things in a literary development. So you can see how Fitzgerald's attitudes to these topics actually change in the chronology of his writing. And you can also follow that up with his own statements from the Crack Up and other essays that he wrote, where he discusses these kind of things, both in presence, but also in retrospect. So it opens up for these kind of conversations on a much more less superficial level, I think, when you have more time allocated to look at Fitzgerald as a more complex author. Because I think the challenge is, if students come out of the Great Gatsby 2 hours and they think this is a book about race, and this is a book where that's fairly unfortunate way of depicting Fitzgerald as an author or his authorship. So
that's an interesting point. I think as well, you know, your suggestion that there are perhaps better texts to explore those, you know, if you're particularly interested in those themes, there's better choices to make. Elisabeth, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
the same thing as Niklas, the question of time. We don't have time to focus on particularly the racial and gender issues. And well, maybe because this French students struggle with the text, they don't ask questions about those topics. But maybe because things are changing, such questions are on the way. I was particularly interested in what I think it's Michael Nolan who said Gatsby is the representation of the outsider, and everything that was said on the session devoted to race the other day. And I think it's a very convenient way of tackling the topic with students. If one day some of my students ask questions about that.
Good, good. I just again, I just want to refer to what Jonathan has sent me. This is more, he's talking about how he contextualizes the novel within a South African context. And I thought this was actually really, really quite interesting, because what he does with this novel is he excuse me, he looks at America in the 1920s and compares it to South Africa. Oh dear. Compares it to South Africa after 1994, so after the fall of the apartheid government. And so he spends a lot of time, I thought this is actually a really interesting way for South African students to look at it. He spends a great deal of time addressing kind of the euphoria of the new, and likened the sense of possibility that was experienced in that kind of mid-1990s in South Africa to America of the 1920s. And he kind of looks at questions like, was there an equivalent? Was there a South African dream? Was it as palpable as the American dream? And was the American dream a society-wide phenomenon? And that's when he starts thinking about what was the situation of African Americans or sharecroppers and so on at that point. What I thought then was really interesting about that then, when we were talking about the film and the fact that for us, we might see the film as contemporary, but for an 18-year-old, it's, you know, it's ancient history. Of course, for Jonathan's contemporary 15 or 16-year-olds, you know, 1994 is a million years away, and they've never known an apartheid South Africa. So again, there's still, you know, it's still this idea that it was a moment of rebirth and new beginnings. But again, to them, it's a new beginning that is already in the past. It's kind of already happened and already gone. But I think it's an interesting, because when I did my teacher training in South Africa, I was not shocked, but I was surprised that it was taught. So, I mean, it's widely taught in South Africa in schools. It's not kind of just an odd thing. It's widely taught, it's widely prescribed, and it's prescribed to actually quite young learners, 15, 16-year-olds. And I think possibly why it did have a certain appeal was that potential linking that you could bring. And of course, then you can also explore the fact that despite Gatsby's apparent success and rise through the ranks from poverty to the dizzy heights, there's a cutoff point, and he kind of hits it through Tom. And you could argue again in South Africa that despite the apparent opportunities that were opening up, there was still, and there remains, huge barriers in the way that stops that fully occurring. So I thought that was quite interesting, looking at the novel in that kind of South African context. What I was hoping to do before we run completely out of time was to think a little bit about some of his other works. We've been very obviously focused on Gatsby, I suppose for kind of obvious reasons, but I was hoping we'd get a chance to speak at least possibly about Tender as the Night, because although it's not taught obviously routinely in an English school, it's definitely something that would be taught at university. Dan, when we used to do kind of big components of coursework, and it was at the discretion of the teacher as to what books were taught, you told me that you did teach Tender as the Night as a text for your A-level students. How did that differ as something to teach compared to Gatsby? Was it more rewarding? I would imagine it was more difficult.
Yeah,
possibly?
I mean, just in simple terms, it's longer, you know, which is always a consideration when you're teaching. I think I think in some ways, I know it sounds like I think they found the context harder a little bit. The idea of the Americans in the South, down in down in south of France and all the rest of it. But I do think that in some ways it was I think in some ways it was for me it was a more rewarding teaching experience. I think certainly. I think there is a fundamental problem with Gatsby, which is that you have to undo a lot of work a lot of the time. No, it's not a love story. No, you wouldn't really want to fall in love with Gatsby. No, yeah, Daisy, that kind of, you have to kind of unpick, this is not the story you think it is. So you have to do quite a lot of work with that sometimes. And of course, the problem I find is obviously the exam is the enemy of the teaching. Actually, if we could just teach this and not worry about the exam, we'd be fine. And if we could just teach this and not worry about what the assessment objectives are, or what the examiners have decided that it's a context text, or it's an interpretation text, or it's whatever it is. And so having the opportunity to teach Tender as the Night for coursework, which was what I was doing at the time, was really, really liberating, because I could choose, if you like, my line of attack through the story. And I think that Dick Diver is a far more interesting character. He's far more substantial character than Gatsby, for a start. I think the point about the vagueness of the love story in some ways is that, whereas I think I actually reread Tender as the Night during lockdown, and I was just surprised by just what a brutal story it was. Again, that often this myth of Fitzgerald as this sentimental sort of character, a sentimental writer. So yeah, I mean, I would really recommend, if given the opportunity to teach Tender as the Night. I've taught some of the short stories as well. And I've done little bits of work with my A-level English language class, looking at the Cracker as a non-fiction as well, which really, really bears a lot of fruit, because the English language students have no literature background at all, and so they come to it fresh in a very different kind of way.
That's a great text to look at in terms of English language teaching, definitely. Elisabeth, do you get to teach Tender as the Night, or do you incorporate it anywhere in your teaching?
I had once the opportunity to teach it to graduate students, and I had paired it with The Sun Also Rises, and therefore I had my French context, post-war France, and it's a long time ago, but it was a good syllabus to work on, and there was this idea of expatriation, and I haven't had the opportunity to do it again, but I enjoyed doing that, and the connections were good, and it worked with the master students because of the French background and this lost generation spirit.
Yeah, it's a great novel. I mean, it's so much more complicated. Niklas, what about you with your masters, your postgraduate students? Is it a text that you do a lot of work with, or are you more focused on the short stories?
No, I mean, they read all the 4 finished novels, and they read about 25 short stories, besides tons of critical material. But I think when it comes to the novels, it's very personal. I mean, some students just connect with one novel, and that becomes a focus area for them when they write their final essay, or if they continue to do work on Fitzgerald, which quite a few of my master students actually have done, as evidenced in their presence at conferences and so on. So yeah, Tender hits the nerve for some students, and some students are just not finding a way into that text. But I would like to say that This Side of Paradise is a wonderful text to teach. And students are generally very engaged with this text and the sort of fragmented, chaotic structure of it. And I find there's a lot of things that we can do with This Side of Paradise. It's an interesting text to bring to students, not only because they are students themselves, reading about students, obviously, but there is something in this, the fragmentation of the narrative that speaks to young people, I think, and this generation where their own lives, like you said before, the flux of the 2021 is very much a fragmentation similar to how we can look at This Side of Paradise. And there's all these kind of intertextual aspects that are quite engaging to look at. I think that The Beautiful and the Damned is the text that is most difficult to operate within. It's just either, you know, it's long, it's too long, it's just kind of static. Yeah, that's the text that the novel that I've been challenged by the most. But then, of course, like somebody said in the panel, in the chat here, that short stories are a wonderful opportunity to bring in all different kind of perspectives. And I think in some ways you see the development of Fitzgerald's style more explicitly, tracing his short story chronology rather than his novels, in fact. So, but of course, our setup is that we do things chronologically. So we do some short stories and then we do novels and short stories and novels. So we bring in all these kind of cluster stories as support for the novels. But like Mayday, I think is an amazing text to use, and one of his best short stories, and students really love that. So, but it's I just want to stress that we've been moving away from authorship in that sense, that almost all teaching at university level is theoretically informed. So you do a post-colonial or decolonial course, or you do a queer course, or you do something on, and we tend to forget the power and the strength of working with authorship, or thinking of courses as monography courses, basically, and allowing our students to really delve into an authorship, which is such a privilege and is such a rare thing at universities. So I've noticed with my students that they bring in a lot of different theoretical concepts and perspectives into Fitzgerald, but they come out of this course with a deep knowledge about an author's career, history, biography, and text that is so valuable for them contextually, whatever direction they take further on in their studies or academic careers. So it's, as you've seen, Helen, it's a lovely thing to be able to do this with Fitzgerald, and I would strongly suggest that more authors would be treated like this at university.
Yeah, I suppose when you think about it, I mean, certainly within a UK context, probably the only author that gets treated like that would be Shakespeare, I suppose. I mean, my undergraduate, you know, there was the paper Shakespeare, and you know, but I can't think of any other author, certainly in the British context, who's treated in that way. And like you say, there's something really to be gained from doing that. That's,
I mean, James Joyce sometimes get that kind of attention too. I know.
Yeah.
Although I mean, I did one whole course semester only on Ulysses, and the students hated me afterwards. So I decided to go back to Fitzgerald again.
Natsuo, in Japan, do you use Tender is the Night or the short stories?
Yes,
or...
yeah. I once read Tender is the Night with my undergrad student, and it took a year and a half. But anyway, you know, as a post-war story and dealing with PTSD, so some of the students seem to find more real to them. The theme is more contemporary than other stories, including Gatsby. So it's not, it was a very good experience.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing is, I think in you know, so much of what we're trying to do in the society, isn't it, is kind of to if you like, de-Gatsbyfy and look at
Right.
some of his other work. I mean, I've been looking at his essays again recently.
Right, and I've just finished
yeah.
Jenkins' Ladder.
Yeah.
That's good.
And some of his essays, I just think are just such remarkable, perfectly formed pieces of text, and they just don't get the attention that they deserve. Or his letters. I mean, I think some of his best writing is in his letters. The letter he wrote the Murphys after their children had died, the one about the golden bowl, it gets me every time. If you don't know that letter, go and read it and bring a packet of tissues, because it's a real tearjerker. Kirk, I don't know if anybody has any question. Oh, I think Elisabeth was just going to say something there.
Because in the chat, I've seen that maybe Gatsby is not the only text we should teach. I wanted to say that I teach The Cruise of the Rolling Junk and to students and a few other self-narratives, and it's great fun. And the text shows Fitzgerald's humor and at the same time his perception of the South. And really, I'm pleased with that, because really I love The Great Gatsby, but definitely we have to teach other texts too. And I'm pleased with that choice. And I recommend it because it's a short text. The students can focus on the text and it works well.
I mean, so those essays as well, you know, how to live on $36,000 a year. I mean, they're funny, you know, amusing, well-crafted, wonderful text, short. So yeah, I mean, I think they can inform that understanding and that engagement with Gatsby by looking at his, you know, even just little sections of his other work when we're teaching that novel. So Kirk, I don't know if anybody has any questions. I don't know if I was able to see questions. I'm not particularly advanced on these things. So
I think we've covered most of them. I was actually going to call dibs and post the last question to folks, if I may. I'm very curious. I think in the past 5 or 6 years, many of us in the United States have become maybe more aware of our ugly Americanism than we have ever before. And I'm just curious, when you teach any Fitzgerald or if you teach Gatsby, do any students, their defenses go up? Do they want to talk contemporary, you know, America first times of type of bigotry, or is that only happening in the United States? I find it very difficult, and we saw this in a couple of our panels, to speak about Fitzgerald's works without wanting to get into contemporary politics. So I'm just curious if that is something that's happening in the cauldron over here, if that's global.
I think as well, I mean, at the moment in the UK, you should hear our conversations in our English office of a morning, me and Dan. You know, we're living through our own kind of peculiar dystopian nightmare.
Sure.
So we've got our own troubles before worrying about yours. No, I don't think it's. I think with the young people that I work with, there is still, I think, a kind of still a great, I don't know if admiration is the right word, but there's still a great interest in all things American, a great enthusiasm for a lot of, obviously, the popular culture that comes out of America. And I think that sense of recent times, that kind of awareness almost, or a feeling perhaps that these last few years in America have just been an unfortunate blip and kind of sanity has been restored. I don't know if that's how people feel, wrongly or rightly. But yeah, I mean, it's strange, because I think the general mood in this country was very concerned and troubled and worried by America First and Trump and all the rest of it. But at the same time, we've ended up with our current incumbent in number 10, who is not radically different in many ways, other than the accent and the educational background. But it's Britain, so obviously you have to go to the right school to get anywhere. It's my lecture over.
Maybe if I have time to answer
Sure.
Kirk. I've got a course on the Roaring Twenties in the United States with the political, economic, and cultural background at stake, and we read Echoes of the Jazz Age, and this is an opportunity to compare the politics of the time with what is happening now and what was happening a few years back. And this is more the kind of course when students will make connections with the contemporary scene in the United States than when we read a text like The Great Gatsby, because it's a culture and history course, and they make connections, and well, it's interesting. But it's a very French approach to the situation, of course, and it's rather critical on their part. It's interesting.
Yeah, I think too that I mean, for young, more radical Swedish students, the US is perhaps emblematic of a specific type of hypercapitalism that they evidently read into The Great Gatsby, I suppose. But I wouldn't say that you know, I wouldn't say, to be blunt, that Trump has in any way interfered with students' experience of The Great Gatsby. I think it's on a more general level that they tend to read in a very contemporary capitalist narrative, and perhaps also eco-critical narrative in terms of the capital scene into The Great Gatsby today, as kind of as a novel showing signs of warnings of things to come, perhaps.
Mhm.
I would just mention the eco-critical perspective. We did I think it was in 2018, we did a piece in the review on a eco-critical reading of Gatsby that was just, you know, it was one of those pieces that you love to get because it just makes you reread the novel entirely differently. Natsuo, I am kind of curious about the fact that that Japan has the second largest Fitzgerald Society in the world, only because the international subsumes everybody. And I know Madeline, we have one teacher here who's teaching at a school in Tokyo, so I'd be interested as well. But I'm just kind of curious, what's your sense of that? And does Gatsby activate any sort of American resistance in students nowadays, or?
Sorry, your question is my sense about Gatsby's impact on Japanese students, or? Sorry, I missed the question, Kirk.
Oh, I'm just curious, when students read any Fitzgerald, do they find there any kind of anti-American resistance kind of pop up?
No, not at all.
Okay. That shocks me, because I have to say, if I were not an American, I would probably feel very anti-American. So I'm just kind of curious about that.
Maybe that's due to my way of teaching.
Yeah. It could be.
I still think that it's still, you know, even if there is at points ambivalence towards it, there still is a feeling that you can do things there that you can't do anywhere else. Now that may be completely a false idea, you know, I don't know, but I think for a lot of people it's still, you know, I remember, you know, when Obama was elected, and my dad saying, for all its faults, for all America's faults, that is the only country in the world where you could be the son of an immigrant and become the president of the United States, because it wouldn't happen anywhere else. And I think that still resonates, I think, for people on some level, even if at times, you know, the relationship is, you know, you struggle with some of the decisions or some of the things that are going on there.
All right. Any other comments or any other? Well, this has been a fabulous panel, and I want to thank Natsuo, Niklas, Elisabeth, Dan, Helen, and Jonathan virtually, or I guess we're all virtual, but spiritually, whatever. I think this is an essential conversation to have. And again, I would just say that some of my favorite pieces we've ever done in the review tend to be the history of different translations, or how Fitzgerald is read in different countries, contexts of countries' histories. So thank you again. And just as a reminder, we'll be back on Friday morning for us, 9 a.m. Eastern. That's 2 p.m. UK, 3 p.m. European time, to honor our Kiel Donaldson travel students. And then after that, we'll be back in exactly 1 week with Jim West, Sarah Churchwell, and David Brown to have a fun kind of archaeological deep dive into the 1920s. So thank you again, everybody, for tuning in, and we will have this up on YouTube later tonight, and we shall see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.